This is the third and last week of our sort of Shabbat food preparation series here. The first week we looked at what we call Shahiyah, which means leaving food on the oven or on the stove, in the oven or in the stove before Shabbat. Last week we talked about Chazara, which means returning something, taking something off the stove or the hot plate or anything like that, and then putting it back on. And today we're going to talk about perhaps what might be even the most practical, which is basically how to warm food up Shabbos morning. Netina mitchila, putting something on from anew. Talking about taking something basically cold out of the fridge and putting it onto the stove. Now, we'll go to sources in just a moment, but one thing I want to make clear is that there really is no way to heat up a liquid on Shabbos. There may be perhaps ways to take a liquid, I don't know what the right term is, and make it less cold, or maybe make it lukewarm or something like that. But there's really no way to heat up a liquid on Shabbos. You can't take a pot of meatballs out of the fridge that has sauce in it, like a lot of sauce in it, or soup or something like that, and heat it up on Shabbos. There's really no way to do that. What we're really going to be talking about are solids. And for the purposes of this discussion, solids could include a little bit of sauce, a little bit of like gelled liquid or something that's in there. Not to like take out a pan of that and to warm it all up, but basically, if you have like roast chicken or something and it has like a little bit of what's really at the time of heating, it's really solid, a little bit, not like a lot, not like a whole pan full of that. But basically the way to think about it would be like taking a pan of, let's say, roast chicken or chicken out of the fridge, and you've got all that gel on the bottom. If you took out each piece of chicken and put it in another pan and you heated that, properly, as we'll see, you'll wind up with some liquid in the bottom of that pan. That's okay. That's fine. But more than that, not. Okay. So let's get to the sources and we'll see what we're talking about here. Okay. So here we are, the Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law for Jews, specifically for Sephardi Jews, and Ashkenazim have comments on it where we agree or disagree. So I'm going to read from here. We have the Hebrew and the English is right next to it. So Davar Shnit Bashel Kol Tzorko, something that was already fully cooked. V'hu yavish she'ein bo marak, and it's dry. It has no soup or sauce in it. Okay, so those are the two qualifications. It has to be fully cooked. We can't be talking about something that's not cooked. We could be talking about a raw piece of chicken that you're going to cook on Shabbos, right? No, it has to be something that's already been cooked, and it's yavesh, it's dry. Now, that doesn't mean that your chicken has to be dried chicken, right? But what we mean by that is that there's no sauce there. And like I defined it for you, if there's a drop there, but it's really chicken, that might be okay. But the point is like not something that's sitting in a sauce. So mutar le'anicho k'neged hamedura, one could put it next to like a fire or a torch, something like that. Even in a place that's hot. And the Ramah comments and says, this is even if it cooled off. If it already cooled off. If it's boiling still. Even if it's something that has a sauce in it or soup in it, mutar, that's permitted. Well, we know that. We did that last week. Meaning that's talking about something where you took something off your hot plate or your blech or the crock pot, right? And it's hot, it's boiling hot. We talked about, remember, you can, if you have the intention to put it back on, you can take out and put it back on, even with the sauce, right? But when we're talking about something that we're putting on that's cold, it's got to be completely dry. Okay, that's the main point here in the first seif here. Here's the next point. To place something that's cold but fully cooked on a hot plate or something like that on fire. So basically the point is, we said in the first one that you could take something and put it next to. So the idea would be like, if you had, I don't know, if you had a hot plate, in the first source it says you could take something, food, and put it next to the hot plate, next to it. This source says not just can you put it next to it, but you could actually put it on if it's something like that. Okay, and that's not agreed on by all, but basically that is the approach that we take. Im hu tavshil shish bo rotev umistamek v'yafelo asor li divrei. But if this is something that has a sauce in it, or that by cooking you're going to make it much better, it's not really fully cooked, you make it much better, so that you wouldn't be allowed to do either. Okay, so basically, sort of same place as we started. It starts with a discussion that you could put it next to something, but then we say, if it's something that you're not putting it directly onto a flame, right? Because in that first source, we're talking about, like, imagine there's a flame, a torch, something hot. You're not putting it directly on it, you're putting it next to it. Now we're saying if you have something like a hot plate, or a pot on top of a pot, or a crock pot, or something like that, so you'd actually be allowed to put it on. Let's look at the next source. Hamashkim baboker. Actually, before we go there, do any questions or comments before I get to the next source? Let me just make sure we're okay. Good? Yeah. Are you asking a question?
So you could take something and put it on a blech where it's yad soledet bo, where it's...
No, that's what we're going to get to in the next
Okay.
piece. Okay. So somebody wakes up in the morning, mashkim baboker, you see that your food is getting dry. Like, basically the cholent's getting dry, right? Like you didn't put enough liquid. You're afraid it's going to get really dry. It's going to burn. So what should you do? So let's just picture it. You have a blech, let's say, and you have a cholent on the blech, and it's cooked. It's continuing to cook all night. And then you see, oh, it's going really down. What am I going to do here? Okay. So, by the way, one thing you could do, we learned this last week, is you could put boiling hot water directly from one into the other, right? Like, so if you had your water urn, you could put it directly in. There's no way to do that on the stove, because you can't take the pot and pick up the pot and pour it in, because then the pot wouldn't be directly on the flame, right? So here's another suggestion. So what can you do? So you don't want to take it off because it'll get cold. Right? Normally, if it wasn't Shabbos, you turn the fire down. That's what you would do, but you can't turn the fire down, right? So what can you do? So Yachola Hasir Lenech Cadaver Yeshana Rekanit Al Piakira. So what you could do is you could take an empty pot, take a pot out of the closet, empty pot, or an empty pan, or aluminum pan, right? Put it onto the blech, and then put the pot on top of that. Right. So what does this do? It's going to keep it warm, but not cook it as high. It's sort of the effect of turning down the flame. You have to be careful not to put that pot that you took off onto the floor, and that it should still be boiling. Because this is what we talked about last week. This is chazara, meaning you're taking this pot off and you're putting it back on, right? If there's liquid in there, which there is, that's why we're talking about this, you wouldn't be able to take a cold and put it on. So you can't interrupt the step of taking it off the fire and putting it back onto the fire. That's called chazara. And so that's why he says here, it has to still be boiling, and you don't put it down completely. You could put it on the counter or something, and you hold on to the pot, hold on to the handle of the pot, like we talked about doing, right? Okay, now here's the case that was just asked about before. Says the Magen Avraham. V'yesh lomar davka tzli mutar litno lechatchila al gabe kira grufa. Aval mevushal asur litno al gabe kira. Afilu hu cham she'im bo mishum bishul v'gazrin an shema yitain alav k'shukar ve'ein mutar ele chazara. Only dry foods may be, this is source 15, may be placed anew on top of another pot. However, liquids may not be placed anew on top of another pot, even while they're still hot, lest you come to do it when they're cold and violate the malacha of cooking. Only returning would be permitted, right? So what we're talking about here is that you can't ever take something out and put it directly over the flame. That would only be if it had been there on the blech from beforehand. But even when we're talking about placing a pot and then something on top of the other pot, we're only talking about dry foods being allowed to do that. Liquids, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. Meaning to take a liquid out and put it on top of a pot, right? Because the concern is, and by the way, it says even when it's hot, because the concern is that you might come to do that when it's cold, right? So the only time you'd be allowed to put a liquid even on top of a pot would be when it's been on the stove already. Okay. Hang on one sec. Okay, let me stop for a second and just see if there are any questions or comments. Did I answer your question, Ima? I'm not sure I answered it or not. What was your question? I thought we were going to address it. Maybe I'm thinking later in the source sheet.
I don't know. I was confused about putting something on a place on the blech where it would get to be yatzolet bo, where it's very, very hot.
Right.
You could take something cold and put it on a place where it would be very, very hot. I thought you couldn't do that.
I think you can do that as long as you're not putting it onto, if it's dry, as long as you're not putting it directly over the flame. Right? I mean, you could.
So even if it's, as long as it's near, even if the place you would touch is really, really hot, but it's not directly over.
I don't think that's a problem. I think that's analogous to the case of the hot plate.
Okay.
You put something on a hot plate that's dry, right? So
yeah.
I think
that's pleasant.
Other questions? Okay, so let's go back to the source sheet. So now we're going to get into an interesting topic that comes up and that has some practical ramifications in modern times. The Pri Megadim, one of the commentaries, says the following: Kshemoshiv, this is source number 16. Kshemoshiv al gabe kedera sheish tavshil b'tocha. When you're putting one pot on top of another pot that has food in it. Ein zeh derech bishul. That's not a way to cook. Umutar af lechatchila, and therefore it's permitted. Right? So you have a cholent on, or whatever. I mean, you have a hot plate, you have a cholent on a blech, you have a crock pot on. You could put something on top of that pot. You could take out like whatever it is, a piece of kugel and put it on top of the pot. That's fine because nobody cooks like that. However, he says Uvasiif Gimel in section 3, Lo Shiv al Gabe Keder Rekanit, where we said that you could take an empty pot out and put on top of that pot. Shnotin atav af hayasham ve'af hayasham me'atzmo. Even if that empty pot had been there from before, since it's empty, lo hava rak kigrufa v'ktuma mikol makam lechatchila asor ulekach ba'inan shlo yitin al gabe karka. He says, it's even if it's an empty pot, even if it's from yesterday, basically it's no different than a blech. That's his point. Basically, it's no different than a blech. Okay, so here's the question. Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked the following. Ha'imutar lechamim, or Moshe Feinstein, one of the leading halachic decisors, was asked the following. Ha'imutar lechamim kedera shnitbal shla v'hichama. Is it permitted to warm something that is fully cooked on something that is made to warm and not to cook, such as an electric hot plate? So basically, can you take out a piece of kugel on Shabbos and put it on the hot plate to heat it up. So he says the following: Al pleitat chashmalit im efshar litbashel sham. If you have a hot plate and it's impossible to cook on there, az mutar lahamid kedera chama im ein sham ela mida achat lachom v'im yesh shtei midot asur. He says you can take a warm food out on an electric hot plate, place it. Since it's impossible for the food to become cooked there, and he says, but that's specifically if it only has one temperature setting, but not if it's adjustable. The concern about the adjustable would be having to do with, like that whole thing we talked about, like stoking the coals, right? So he doesn't want it to be adjustable. This is basically the hot plates kind of that we generally have. If somebody has a hot plate with adjustable settings, there would be ways to go about that. First of all, he most likely would say that if you cover up those adjustable settings, if you tape them up, it shouldn't be a problem. Secondly, what I would say, and you'll see, I think this is going to be said in just a moment, that anyways, even with adjustable settings, people don't cook on hot plates. No one decides to cook a stew on a hot plate, even with adjustable settings, I don't think. And this is what's said in the next source number 18. Rabbi Mordechai Willig is a current rabbi at Yeshiva University. He says the following: regarding an electric hot plate which is made to warm and not to cook, the concern of looking or feeling like cooking would not apply. If it has only one temperature setting and one cannot adjust it at all, the concern of someone coming to adjust it would not apply. Therefore, it appears to me it is permitted to place a new cold, dry food on it on Shabbos, since none of the reasons to forbid it would apply, right? One concern would be that it looks like cooking. Another concern would be adjusting the temperature. And since we're not doing any of those, it should be okay. Now, he says here one temperature setting. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said also one temperature setting. I don't see what the problem would be if it had more temperature settings, but you had taped them up or you weren't using them. Anytime we have some kind of, and by the way, that's like a crock pot. A crock pot has multiple settings on it, but we permit someone to use it. Now, you might say we permit someone to use it from before Shabbos, but you wouldn't permit someone to take, let's say, cold something out of the fridge and put it into the crock pot on Shabbos. If you're concerned about that, then you can just cover up the settings. You can tape up the settings on the hot plate or on the crock pot, and that seemingly shouldn't be a problem. Okay, so I want to sort of review this and show where this comes up. It's a very interesting case. Here's like a summary: warming food on Shabbos. This comes from a website I found, OU kosher website. Okay. In warming food on Shabbos, there are three issues to consider. The first is potentially d'oraita, the latter two are d'rabbanan. So the first is biblical, the latter two are rabbinic. So bishul is one, actually cooking. Hatmana, which is wrapping, which we saw come up in one place, and chazara, and returning to the flame. Bishul cooking includes, but is not limited to finishing off the cooking, baking of food, so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through all of this. Hatmana is insulating, which refers to the prohibition to wrap hot or warm food on Shabbos on all sides in a manner that preserves the food's heat. Even if the food is fully cooked, this is where I want to go down to. Warming food on Shabbos for the daytime meal. Okay. How then can one warm up food for the daytime Seudat Shabbat, right? For the daytime Shabbos meal. Traditionally, this was done by either putting the food next to, rather than top of, the fire, or by placing it on top of another pot filled with food. That is, sitting on the fire before Shabbos. In both these cases, the warming is done in such an atypical manner that everyone will realize that he is warming and not cooking the food, and the oddity of the situation will remind him not to raise the flame. In this context, food placed on a counter adjacent to the stovetop is next to the fire, but food placed on the hot parts of the blech are on top of the fire, even if food is not directly over the flames. All right, I stand corrected, because that was the case that you brought up. I still don't quite understand how placing something on a blech looks like cooking, because nobody cooks with it on the blech. But, okay, I mean, that's what they say here. So, I guess, does anybody still use a blech? I'm curious. Does anyone use blechs? I guess I'm become so hot plate trained that we use the hot plates. I really still don't see how placing it on the hot part of the stove is and not over a flame is considered like it looks anything like that. But so now they're going to talk about now you talk about here the Cadaver Box, and this is very interesting. Okay, so the Cadaver Box, does anyone have one of these? The Cadaver Box is a rectangular covered shallow pan which is filled with water. Cadaver means pot. So what they did is they made a blech. They tried to turn a blech into a pot, because we said you can put something on top of a pot that's on the stove. So they thought if they turn the blech into a pot, you can then put something on there. Okay, so the Cadaver Box is a rectangular covered shallow pan which is filled with water and placed before Shabbos on the stovetop. Its proponents suggest that the water in the pan renders this a pot of food, and therefore food from the refrigerator can be warmed up on it on top of Shabbos, right? Of course you couldn't do this. Of course, I really stand corrected from before, because of course you couldn't put it on the blech in the hot plate parts, because there would be no need for the Cadaver Box if that was the case, right? So, however, the Cadaver Box's use in this matter has been widely condemned by rabbis, because, as noted, the only reason one may warm up food on top of another pot of food is that doing so is so odd and atypical that it reminds people not to raise the flame and isn't mistaken for cooking. However, the Cadaver Box is so unobtrusive and its food so inconspicuous that people using it barely realize that it's any more than a standard blech, onto which chazara is forbidden, even though it's not the standard method of cooking. And the whole goal of using a hot pot of food is undetermined. So it's very interesting, right? So this Cadaver Box, they thought, right? The idea is you take a kugel out of the fridge on Shabbos and you want to heat it up. So if you put it on, according to this, if you put it on like the blech, directly on the blech, then it seems to be that it's understood that looks like cooking, even though we don't cook on a blech. So you'd put it on top of a pot that's on the blech, like somebody, if they had like a cholent pot or something, or an empty pan or something, perhaps. But what the Cadaver Box tried to be a pot. It's a tray with water on it, and then the cover to that is like a blech. So it's like having a pot with water that you cover and then you put something else on top of it. The people who had a problem with it argued that the whole reason you're allowed to do it on top of a pot, and we saw this mentioned, was because we weren't going to be concerned that it looks like you're cooking or that you are adjusting the temperature or anything like that, because this is such an atypical way of cooking. But by using Cadaver Box, it made it a much more typical way of cooking. And so for some people, this got a lot of opposition. It's hard for me to understand what the problem is with it. It's not a typical way of cooking. Nobody cooks like that. I could prove no one cooks like that. The only people who have anything like a Cadaver Box in the world are observant Jews who are trying to not cook on Shabbos. Like I don't see, no one cooks that way. They're arguing that it looks a lot like a blech. I guess part of the problem is I have a problem in the first place, because I don't think a blech looks like cooking, because I don't think anyone really cooks like that. I suppose you could argue and say, well, people do cook like that, because you could put a cholent on, before Shabbos, and it cooks the cholent. But the same thing's true for a crock pot. I mean, you would never, if it wasn't Shabbos, use a blech for cooking. You would never, if it wasn't Shabbos, use a Cadaver Box for cooking. So I don't know exactly what the problem is, but some people supposedly had a problem with this. So that's actually wraps up the information I wanted to share today, which gives us a few minutes for questions, comments, concerns about anything from today or anything relating to Shabbos cooking or anything that we covered. Yeah, Varen.
This is so minute, but like the Cadaver with the hot water that you're talking about, like there are people, I envision it as like a double boiler. So there are people that, for instance, if you make a cheesecake in the oven, you put a pot of water in there. So my question is, can you use your oven then if you put a pan of water in your oven, cover it, and then just use your oven, because that's atypical? for me at least.
It's an interesting point about the double boiler. I would have to think about that, or what that means for any of it, because it's actually interesting. You're saying those against
the double boiler is allowed on a blech, then is the double boiler allowed in the oven?
Right. So nothing's ever going to be allowed in the oven. You can't ever put anything into the oven on Shabbos, ever. There's no scenario where you can put something into the oven on Shabbos, and that applies. This goes back to the first week. That applies to anything and everything. Like even if you have a Shabbos mode oven, even to the extent that probably even if your oven's off, you shouldn't put something into the oven on Shabbos, just because it really looks like cooking, and that's fair. I mean, we don't have a way of distinguishing putting something into the oven when it's not cooking from putting something into the oven when it is cooking. What I mean by that is we have a way of distinguishing on the stovetop. You put on a blech, right? So now we see that it's not cooking, but in the oven, we don't have a way, with the exception of the fact that I mentioned that some say, and I think Rav Moshe Feinstein says this, that in theory, if you somehow constructed a blech box, right, meaning on the stovetop, the blech covers from the flame. So in the stove, not the flame, but the heat's coming from all over. So you'd have to like construct a box, some kind of box, which I suppose a person really could do, and then put it into that. And that would be obvious enough that you're not cooking. Now, I suppose you'd have to let people know, like when when your guests came over, you'd say, now look at what I have. Look at my stove. See this? I've got this thing. I'm not really cooking. It's just warming it up, whatever. Then we could, if you want to go to that extent, then you could talk about whether that's actually, I don't know anyone who does this, but basically we're never allowed putting into the oven on Shabbos. And that's why, going back to like first week, what you could do is before Shabbos, you could have something in your oven. And if you've removed the problems of a light or the temperature going up or anything like that, and that's what the Shabbos mode helps with, you could take stuff out one time on Shabbos. Or if your oven was off, you could take food out and close the door if it's off, and then take more food out a little bit later. Someone was telling me that they like to heat their challah up. So like they want to take their challah out first, like for hamotzi, and then maybe a half hour later, they're going to take out the rest of their food. They could do that as long as the oven is off. If the oven is on, even if it's on Shabbos mode, they won't be allowed to do that. But you're never going to have a situation where you could put the food into the oven on Shabbos. Your double boiler point is a really interesting point, because what everyone's banking on is what we're saying is that nobody cooks on, a pot on top of a pot. Is the double boiler, doesn't it go like into the bottom pot?
It sits on top, just as long as it doesn't touch the boiling water, I think. I mean, I'm not a pro, but like a bowl sitting in a pot, but the bottom of the bowl doesn't actually, it's just heated by the steam that's created.
It's very interesting. I wonder if, practically no one's bothered by that, because we do it. I wonder if maybe the answer would be that it's still not a standard mode for cooking. Like you don't, you only specially cook special things that way or something like that. Maybe that would be different. But yeah, it's a good point. It's a good question. And it's good clarification that we're never talking about putting into the oven on Shabbos.
And then other than creating habits, or like your kids possibly seeing something that looks like something else, like can you do these things that are technically okay? Like even now, if you don't have Shabbos guests and you're just by yourself in your house?
Yeah, so you can. So it's a very interesting. Like we'd have to delve specifically into this area to really get to it. But it is, when we're talking about the Shabbos stuff, it is it's inherent to the law in a way that's a little bit different in other places. Like it's not the same thing as when we say, like they used to say, though, I think they say it's okay these days, but like, don't go into like a McDonald's to get a coffee because someone might think you're going in there to get a burger, right? It's different than that. That it's not inherent in the law. It's an external concern that we have. With this inherent in the law, when they established the cooking on Shabbos, inherent in it was you can't do certain things because that looks too much like cooking. Perhaps maybe we would be maybe if we defined it as not, it looks too much like cooking, but it feels too much like cooking, maybe that would work too. Meaning, but that's really kind of what we mean by it. We're not really afraid someone's going to see this and make us think. And we're not really concerned that someone's going to be around. Like if someone were to say, hey, I live on a desert island, there's nobody here. We're not really concerned that someone's going to see it and be concerned, right? We really, I guess, more concerned that it feels like, it seems like that kind of thing. This is what it looks like you're doing, right? And somehow that is concerned. Now, maybe you could say that that gets to your habits point, and that's really what it's about, So I don't think that there's a clear definition of like what exactly the concern is, but it's not that we're really concerned that we might have guests over and they're going to think that we're not keeping Shabbos. That's not really I don't think that's what we're really concerned about. Yeah. Any other questions or concerns or comments or cases? Okay, awesome. So just to sort of summarize what we covered in these 3 weeks, obviously we didn't cover everything, and there's a lot more to cover even in these areas, and of course plenty of other areas. But I think we did a pretty good dive into the laws of warming food up on Shabbos. We talked the first week about here. I'll pull this up for us, and the source sheet is available. I sent it to the people who wanted it, and we also posted it each day with each time we had a class. The first week we covered issues relating, well, first of all, we talked about what cooking was, and we established these principles. Looks like cooking, that was what Farah was just talking about. Then Shema Yachatat, we're also concerned about the concept of stoking the coals, which actually is cooking. And then we talked about there being a difference between things that are cooked versus things that are not cooked. And then we saw how these played out below and how we could set something up before Shabbos. We talked about what constitutes covering, and we talked about covering knobs and also the blech that we use. And we also talked about how we could set things up before Shabbos, right? We talked about like you could put on something that was either half or a third cooked or completely raw. But the main concern is that we shouldn't have a situation where someone's going to be tempted to adjust the flame in order to be able to eat it that night. That was the first week. The second week, we talked about returning food to the stove on Shabbos. This was last week. We talked about like if you have food on the blech or on a hot plate or on a crock pot and you want to take it off and then put it back, we talked about here are the general principles, that it has to be fully cooked, that you have to have the intention to return it, and that you can't place it down completely. You can put it like on a counter and you can have your hand on it being prepared to put it back on. And then finally today we discussed this cases of heating food up on Shabbos, taking it out of the fridge and putting it on the hot plate or on some other heating device. And we talked about how we're talking about specifically about dry. We're not talking about something that's liquid. We clarified along the way, thanks for correcting me, that we couldn't put it directly onto the blech, even in a place that doesn't have the fire. That's how we get to the idea of putting another pot on top of, or eventually to this idea of a Cadaver Box. But you could put it onto a hot plate, because we're not concerned that it looks any kind like cooking. And finally, we looked at that interesting case of the Cadaver Box and how for some people this would really solve their problems, but perhaps some feel that it looks too much like cooking, or it's not obvious enough that there's a blech there. And then we have to, and we're left with Vered's absolutely groundbreaking question about whether a double boiler changes all the rules for everyone.
I hope I haven't created another restriction for people.
You're going to ruin it. Yeah. So thank you for joining. I hope you learned something. And have a great day, and happy warming food up for Shabbos.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. All the best. Thanks for joining. Be well.